Chapter 5. Before this morning, Homer Wells had not had an occasion to think about the soul. A study of the soul had not been a part of his training. Dr. Larch had asked Homer to prepare a fetus for an autopsy. A woman had been stabbed, or she had stabbed herself. The pregnancy of the woman was nearly full term. Dr. Larch had attempted to rescue the child, but the child, or, rather, the embryo, nearly 9 months, had also been stabbed. Like its mother, the boy had died. Dr. Larch had asked Homer to help him determine the cause of death. Homer cut the little body. He had never looked inside a fetus before. What was the life of the embryo but a history of development? Homer turned to the section in Gray's devoted to the embryo. It was a shock for him to remember that the book did not begin with the embryo, it ended with it. The embryo was the last thing, which was considered. In Gray's, Homer saw the profile view of the head of a human embryo at 27 days old. It didn't look like human, it had a face of a fish. But in 8 weeks the fetus has a nose and a mouth. It has an expression, thought Homer Wells. And with this discovery, that a fetus has an expression, Homer Wells felt the presence of a soul. He put the little dead body in a white enamel examining tray. The tiny fingers of its hands were slightly open. The color of the dead baby was gray. Homer turned to the sink and vomited in it. When he turned on water to clean the sink, the old pipes vibrated and howled. He thought that the room was trembling because of the pipes. He wasn't thinking about the wind from the coast, how strong it was. Homer wasn't blaming Dr. Larch. If Wilbur Larch was a saint to Nurse Angela and to Nurse Edna, he was both a saint and a father to Homer Wells. Larch knew what he was doing, and for whom. However, Homer had his own opinion. You can call it a fetus, or an embryo, thought Homer Wells, but it's alive. And if you perform an abortion, you kill it. He looked at the little dead body. If it's a fetus to Dr. Larch, that's fine. But it's a baby to me, thought Homer Wells. If Larch has a choice, I have a choice, too. He picked up the tray and carried it into the hall, like a proud waiter carrying a special dish to a favorite guest. Soon Homer was at the door of Nurse Angela's office, which was open. He could see Dr. Larch at the typewriter. The doctor wasn't writing, there wasn't even any paper in the machine. Dr. Larch was just looking out the window. The state of a dream was so clear on Wilbur Larch's face that Homer Wells paused in the doorway. He almost turned around and took the baby away with him. Homer hesitated, then he stepped forward and put the metal tray on top of the typewriter. Dr. Larch? Homer Wells said. Larch looked away from his dream. He stared over the baby at Homer. The source of the bleeding was the pulmonary artery, which was slashed, as you see, Homer said, as Larch looked down at the baby. "Goddamn," said Wilbur Larch, staring at the artery. "I have to tell you that I won't perform an abortion, not ever," Homer Wells said. This followed, logically, from the severed artery. In Homer's mind, it followed, but Dr. Larch looked confused. "You won't?" Larch said. "You what?" Homer Wells and Dr. Larch just stared at each other. The baby was between them. "Not ever," Homer Wells said. "Do you disapprove?" Dr. Larch asked Homer. "I don't disapprove of you," Homer Wells said. "I disapprove of it, it's not for me." "Well, I've never forced you," Dr. Larch said. "And I never will. It's all your choice." "Right," said Homer Wells. "And if it's all the same to you," Homer Wells said to him, "I'd like permission to not be there, when you do what you have to do. I want to be of use in any other way, and I'm not disapproving of you," Homer said. "If it's okay, I just don't want to watch it." "I'll have to think about that, Homer," Dr. Larch said. For the last 3 hours, Candy Kindle and Wally Worthington had maintained an awkward silence. It had still been dark when they left the coast at Hartshaven and went inland, away from the wind, although the wind was still surprisingly strong. Candy's honey blonde hair was all around her face. Wally glanced at the unread book in Candy's lap. The book was Little Dorrit One by Charles Dickens. It was required summer reading for all the girls in Candy's class. Candy had begun it 4 or 5 times, but she had no idea what the book was about. Wally, who was no reader, didn't notice the name of the book. He just watched the same page and thought about Candy. He was also thinking about street clouds. He was already in his mind through the abortion. Candy was recovering nicely, the doctor was telling jokes, all the nurses were laughing. There were enough nurses to win a war, in Wally's imagination. All of them were young and pretty. And the orphans were amusing children. In the trunk of Senior Worthington's Cadillac, Wally had 3 apple boxes full of sweets for the orphans. In the spring, there weren't any fresh apples, and there wasn't any cider, but Wally had loaded the Cadillac with jars of jelly and honey. Candy closed her book and returned it to her lap again, and Wally felt he had to say something. "How's the book?" he said. "I don't know," Candy said, and laughed. Soon they were in street clouds. Little Dorrit dropped from Candy's lap. "Please," Wally whispered to her, "you don't have to do this. You can have the baby." I want the baby, I want your baby. It would be fine. We can just turn around, he begged her. But she said, no, Wally. It's not the time for us to have a baby. She put her face down. The car stood still. Are you sure? Wally whispered to her. You don't have to. But Candy Kendall was more practical than Wally Worthington, and she had her father's stubbornness. Mrs. Grogan, across the road in the girls' division entrance, observed the Cadillac. There was a small crowd around the Cadillac. The trunk was open and the handsome young man was giving presents to the orphans. Sorry, it's not the season for apples, kids, Wally was saying. Or cider. You could all use a little cider, he said cheerfully, handing out the jars of honey and jelly. A boy named Smoky Fields had opened his jar of apple cider jelly and was eating it out of the jar with his hand. It's really good on toast, in the morning, Wally said cautiously, but Smoky Fields stared at Wally in surprise. Smoky Fields intended to finish the jar of jelly on the spot. A girl called Mary Agnes dropped a jar of the apple jelly at Candy's feet. Oops, Candy said, bending to pick up the jelly for her. When she stood up and handed the girl her jar of jelly, Candy felt a little dizzy. Some adults were coming out of the hospital entrance, and their presence helped Candy compose herself. I've not come here to play with children, she thought. I'm Dr. Larch, the old man was saying to Wally, who looked shocked by the determination with which Smoky Fields was eating the jelly. Wally Worthington, Wally said, shaking Dr. Larch's hand, handing him a jar of honey. It's fresh from Ocean View Orchards. That's in Hart's Rock, but we're very near the coast, we're in Hart's Haven, almost. Hello, Candy said to Homer because he was the tallest person, he was as tall as Wally. I'm Candy Kendall, she said to him. And do you work here? Or are you one of? Was it polite to say them, she wondered. Not exactly, Homer mumbled, thinking, I work here, inexactly, and I am inexactly one of them. His name's Homer Wells, a boy told Candy. He's too old to adopt. I can see that, Candy said, feeling shy. I should talk to the doctor, she thought. I'm in the apple business, Wally was saying to Dr. Larch. It's my father's business. Actually, he added, my mother's business. What does this fool want? Thought Wilbur Larch. Oh, I love apples, Nurse Edna said. You should have your own apples, Wally said. Look at that hill, he said. You ought to plant it. I could even get you the trees. in 6 or 7 years, you'd have your own apples, you'd have apples for more than 100 years. What do I want with 100 years of apples? Thought Wilbur Larch. Wouldn't that be pretty, Wilbur? Nurse Edna asked. And you could get your own cider press, Wally suggested. Give the kids fresh apples and fresh cider, they'd have lots to do. They don't need things to do, thought Dr. Larch, they need places to go. They're from some charity, thought Nurse Angela cautiously. They're too young to give their money away, thought Wilbur Larch. Bees. Wally was saying. You should keep bees, too. It's fascinating for the kids, and a lot safer than most people think. Have your own honey, and give the kids an education. Bees are a model society, a lesson in teamwork. Oh, shut up, Wally, Candy was thinking. Dr. Larch looked around at the children stuffing themselves with honey and jelly. Have they come here to play with the orphans for a day and to make everyone sick? He wondered. Candy felt helpless, no one understood why she was standing there. Then Homer Wells looked at her, their eyes met. Candy thought that he had seen her many times before, that he'd watched how she grew up, had seen her naked. It was shocking to Homer he had already fallen in love with Candy to see in her eyes an unwanted pregnancy. I think you'd be more comfortable inside, he murmured to her. Yes, thank you, Candy said, not able to look in his eyes now. Larch saw the girl walking toward the hospital entrance and thought suddenly, oh, it's just another abortion, that's all. He turned to follow the girl and Homer, just as Smoky Fields finished the jar of jelly and began to eat a jar of honey. Homer led the way to Nurse Angela's office. At the threshold, he saw the dead baby's hands reaching above the edge of the white tray, which was still on Nurse Angela's typewriter. Homer's reflexes were quick enough, he pushed Candy back into the hall. This is Dr. Larch, Homer said to Candy, introducing them on the way to the dispensary. Wilbur Larch did not remember that there was a dead baby on top of the typewriter in Nurse Angela's office. I'll deliver the woman from Damariscotta, Homer said in a low voice to Dr. Larch. Well, don't hurry, Larch answered. I mean I won't help this one, Homer whispered, looking at Candy. I won't even look at her, do you understand? Dr. Larch looked at the young woman. He thought he understood, a little. She was a very pretty young woman, even Dr. Larch could see that, and he'd not seen Homer so excited before. Homer thinks he's in love, thought Dr. Larch. Or he thinks that he'd like to be. Have I been very insensitive? Larch wondered. Wally introduced himself to Homer Wells. If I could have just a moment's peace with Miss Kendall, said Wilbur Larch, we can all meet each other another time. Edna will assist me with Miss Kendall, please, and Angela, would you help Homer with the Damariscotta woman? Homer, Dr. Larch explained to Wally and to Candy, is an excellent midwife. You are? Wally said to Homer enthusiastically. Wow! Homer Wells maintained silence. Nurse Angela touched Homer's arm very gently and said to him, I'll help you. Please do it, then, Dr. Larch said. If I could just have a moment alone with Miss Kendall, he repeated, but he saw that Homer was unaware that he was staring at Candy. If I could just explain a little of the process to Miss Kendall, Wilbur Larch said to Wally. It was hopeless to address Homer. I'd like her to know about the bleeding, later, for example, Larch added. Is someone going to cut her? He asked Homer pathetically. Homer caught Wally's arm and pulled him abruptly away. He got him outdoors so quickly that Wally didn't throw up until the two of them were behind the boys' division. The two young men walked up and down and across the hill. Homer, politely, explained the procedure that Candy would undergo, but Wally wanted to talk about apple trees. This hill is perfect for your garden, Wally said. If she's in the first 3 months, Homer noted, there is no need to cut. I'd recommend different sorts of apple trees, Wally said. There will be some bleeding, we call it spotting, actually, because it's usually not very heavy bleeding, Homer told Wally. Dr. Larch knows how to use ether, so don't worry, she won't feel a thing. Of course, she'll feel something afterward, admitted Homer. Dr. Larch calls that psychological discomfort. You could come back to the coast with us, Wally told Homer. We could load a truck full of baby trees, and in a day or two we could come back here and plant the orchard together. It wouldn't take too long. It's a deal, said Homer Wells. The coast, he thought. I want to see the coast. And the girl. I want to ride in that car with that girl. A midwife, Wally said. Are you going to be a doctor? I don't think so, said Homer Wells. I don't know yet. Well, apples are my family's business, Wally said. I'm going to college, but I really don't know why I bother. College, thought Homer Wells. Candy's father is a lobsterman, Wally explained, but she's going to go to college, too. Lobster, thought Homer Wells. The bottom of the sea. From the bottom of the hill, Nurse Angela was waving to them. The woman is ready, she called to Homer Wells. I have to deliver someone's baby, Homer told Wally. Wally didn't want to leave the hill. I think I'll stay up here. I don't think I want to hear anything, he added. He gave Homer a smile. Oh, there's not much noise, Homer said. He wasn't thinking of the Damariscotta woman, he was thinking of Candy. He left Wally on the hill and went toward Nurse Angela. He looked back at Wally once and waved. Wally was his age and his size. They were the same height, although Wally was more muscular, from sports, Dr. Larch had guessed. He has the body of a hero, Dr. Larch thought, remembering the heroes he had tried to help in France, in World War I. Lean but well muscled, that was a hero's body, and full of holes, thought Wilbur Larch. He didn't know why Wally's body reminded him of this. Wilbur Larch was thinking about Wally's face. It was handsome in a finer way than Homer's face, which was also handsome. Although Wally's body was stronger, his bones were more delicate. There wasn't a trace of anger in Wally's eyes, they were the eyes of good intentions. He had the body of a hero, and the face the face of a benefactor. Concluded Wilbur Larch, performing an abortion on Candy. The beauty in her face, Larch thought, was like she was free of guilt. It surprised Larch. Wally is a benefactor, thought Wilbur Larch. Homer has met his benefactor. Homer Wells was thinking about the same. I have met a Prince of Maine, he was thinking. I have seen a King of New England, and I am invited to his castle. I am going to the coast, thought Homer Wells. Push, he said to the woman from Damariscotta. Is Damariscotta on the coast? He asked the woman, who held Nurse Angela's hand in a grip. Near it, the woman cried, and shoved her child forth into street clouds. Its head was captured perfectly in the palm of Homer's confident right hand. His left hand lifted the baby's bottom as he guided the baby outdoors. As Dr. Larch usually said, it was a boy. Homer decided to name him Stareforth. The baby was his second solo delivery. Homer cut the cord and smiled to hear young Steerforth's healthy cry. Candy, coming out of ether, heard the baby's cries and shuddered. She felt some guilt. Is it a boy or a girl? She asked in a low voice. Only Nurse Edna heard her. Why is it crying? Candy asked. It was nothing, dear, Nurse Edna said. It's all over. I would like to have a baby, one day, Candy said. I really would. Why, of course, dear, Nurse Edna told her. You can have as many as you want. You will have Princes of Maine. Dr. Larch told Candy suddenly. You will have Kings of New England. Wilbur Larch listened to the cries of the Damariscotta woman's baby and thought that he mustn't be selfish, he must encourage Homer to make friends with this young couple. And people will always eat apples, he thought, it must be a nice life. A few minutes later Homer and Dr. Larch were talking. Dr. Larch was examining the baby that Homer Wells had delivered, young Steerforth. But they weren't talking about Steerforth. Wally said it would take just a couple of days, Homer Wells was saying. We'll have to load a truck, I guess. There's going to be 40 trees. And I'd like to see the coast. Of course, you should go, Homer, it's a great opportunity, Dr. Larch said. I will be away just 2 days, Homer Wells said. Wilbur Larch shook his head. Maybe just 2 days, Homer, Dr. Larch said. You should be prepared to take advantage of the situation. And just 2 days are not enough. Homer stared at Dr. Larch. If this young couple likes you, Homer, and if you like them well, Larch said, I think you'll be meeting their parents, too. And if their parents like you well, said Dr. Larch, I think you should try to make their parents like you. He wasn't looking at Homer, who was staring at him. I think we both know it would do you good to get away for more than 2 days, Homer, Dr. Larch said. You understand. I'm not talking about an adoption, I'm talking about the possibility of a summer job, for a start. Someone might invite you to stay away for more than 2 days, that's all I'm saying. Dr. Larch looked at Homer, they stared at each other. Right, Homer finally said. Of course. You might want to come back in 2 days. Larch said heartily, but they looked away from each other, as they chose to look away from the possibility of that. In which case, Larch said, you know you're always welcome here. He left the room, and Homer with the baby. He left too quickly. Again, for Homer to say how much he loved him. Then Wilbur Larch took Nurse Angela and Nurse Edna into the dispensary. Perhaps the authorized atmosphere of the dispensary helped Wilbur Larch say to his loyal nurses what he needed to say. I want to give Homer as much money as we can, said Wilbur Larch. I want to give him some decent clothes, too. Just for 2 days, Wilbur? Nurse Edna asked. How much money does the boy need for 2 days? Nurse Angela asked. It's an opportunity for him, don't you see? Dr. Larch asked. I don't think he'll be back here in 2 days. I hope he doesn't come back, at least, not so soon, said Wilbur Larch and remembered the story of Homer's weak heart. How could he tell him? Where and when? He crossed the hall to see how Candy was coming along. He knew that she and Wally wanted to leave as soon as possible. They had a long drive ahead of them. And if Homer Wells is leaving me, thought Wilbur Larch, he'd better leave me in a hurry. Homer had to leave in a hurry, now, because Dr. Larch needed to see if he would ever get over it. I don't think so, he thought. You're doing just fine, Dr. Larch told Candy. He was about to tell her that Homer could advise her about any cramps she suffered, but he wanted to leave Homer free of that responsibility. They're taking you? Curly Day asked Homer, when Curly saw Homer packing. They don't want to adopt me, Curly, said Homer Wells. I'll be back in just 2 days. They're taking you, said Curly Day. His face looked so stricken that Homer had to turn away. Dr. Larch understood the power of information that is received indirectly. For that reason, he told Candy and Wally about Homer's weak heart. I've never let him go before, not even for just 2 days, without saying just a little about his condition, Dr. Larch told Candy and Wally. A wonderful word, condition. The effect of the word in a doctor's mouth is truly astonishing. Candy forgot that she'd just had an abortion. The color came back to Wally's face. It's his heart, said Wilbur Larch. I've not told him about it because I haven't wanted to worry him, Dr. Larch said to these two good-hearted people, who gave him their full attention. He shouldn't do anything too strenuous and he shouldn't worry, said Wilbur Larch, who had created a perfect history for someone who simply needed to stay out of danger. Larch had given his favorite orphan a history that would keep him safe. Homer Wells, at the moment, couldn't make up anything that would be soothing to Curly Day, who buried himself under several pillows and a blanket and sobbed. What do you need to be adopted for? Curly cried. You're practically a doctor. It's just for 2 days, Homer Wells repeated, with each repetition, his promise sounded less and less convincing. They're taking you. I can believe it, cried Curly Day. Nurse Angela came and sat beside Homer on Curly's bed. Together they looked at the sobbing heap under the blanket. It's just for 2 days, Curly, Nurse Angela said weakly. Dr. Larch said that Homer was here to protect us. Curly cried. You're not the best one, Homer. Curly cried, under the blanket. Right, Homer said. He tried to pat Curly, but Curly stiffened and held his breath. I'll see you, Curly, Homer said. Traitor! Cried Curly Day. Homer left Curly with Nurse Angela and went to the operating room to clean the table. He knocked before he entered the operating room, where Candy had dressed herself, with Wally's help. You can relax now, said Homer Wells, not quite able to look at Candy's face. Maybe you'd like some fresh air. Then he added to Candy, "You're feeling all right, aren't you?" "Oh, yes," she said and smiled reassuringly at Wally. Just then, Dr. Larch came in. "You two should get some fresh air," he said to Wally and Candy, who took his suggestion for a command. They left the operating room. Homer Wells gave the operating table a thorough inspection, a final examination, a last look. He once more counted the money Dr. Larch had given him. There was almost $50. He went to the boys' sleeping room. Nurse Angela was sitting there on the bed. She kissed Homer, Homer kissed her, and left her without a word. Nurse Edna went outside to see what the young people were doing. Wally was peering under the hood of the car, and Candy was resting in the Cadillac's spacious back seat. The convertible top was down. Nurse Edna bent over Candy and whispered to her, "You're as pretty as a picture." Candy smiled warmly. Nurse Edna could see how exhausted the girl was. "Listen, dear," Nurse Edna said to her. "Don't be shy," Nurse Edna said to her confidentially. "If you have any peculiar cramps, speak to Homer about it. Promise me you won't be shy about it, dear," Nurse Edna said. "I promise," Candy said, blushing. Melanie was struggling to inscribe the copy of Little Dorrit, which she had stolen for Homer when she heard Mary Agnes Cork throwing up in the bathroom. "Shut up," Melanie called, but Mary Agnes went on retching. She'd eaten 2 jars of apple cider jelly and 1 jar of honey. Smoky Fields had already thrown up. He'd eaten all his jars and a jar belonging to one of the little Walshes. He lay miserably in his bed. To Homer Wells for the promise, "You made me," Melanie wrote. "Love, Melanie added. Homer Wells walked into the operating room to say goodbye to Wilbur Larch. "I love you," said Homer Wells. He knew he had to leave the room, and so he started to leave. "I love you, too, Homer," said Wilbur Larch. He heard Homer say right, before he heard the door close. "Right," Wilbur Larch repeated to himself. Outside, Homer Wells stuck his bag in the Cadillac's trunk, smiled at Candy in the back seat, helped Wally raise the convertible's top. "See you in 2 days," Nurse Edna said to Homer, too loudly. "2 days," Homer repeated, too quietly. She pecked his cheek, he patted her arm. Nurse Edna then turned and walked to the hospital entrance. When she was inside the hospital, Nurse Edna went directly to the dispensary and threw herself on the bed. Dr. Larch sat in his usual place, At the typewriter, the fetus displayed by Homer Wells didn't disturb him at all. Busy work, give me busy work, thought Wilbur Larch. Just before night fell, he leaned forward in his chair enough to turn on the desk lamp. Then he settled back in the chair in which he had spent so many evenings. It was not yet dark, but he could hear an owl outside, very distinctly. When it was still light, Melanie looked out her window and saw the Cadillac pass, and Melanie recognized Homer Wells in the passenger seat. Melanie knew that his promise was broken. She saw the beautiful girl with the long legs in the back seat of the car, and she had a longer, better look at the profile of Homer Wells. When she closed the stolen copy of Little Dorrit, the ink was still wet and her inscription was smudged. She threw the book against the wall. Melanie went straight to bed without her dinner. Mrs. Grogan went to Melanie's bed and felt her forehead, which was feverish, but Mrs. Grogan could not persuade Melanie to drink anything. All Melanie said was, "He broke his promise." Later, she said, "Homer Wells has left St. Cloud's." "You have a little temperature, dear," said Mrs. Grogan, but when Homer Wells didn't come to read Jane Eyre aloud that evening, Mrs. Grogan started paying closer attention. She allowed Melanie to read to the girls that evening. Melanie's voice was passionless. Melanie's reading from Jane Eyre depressed Mrs. Grogan. Nurse Angela had hardly any more success, reading aloud to the boys' division from Dickens. Discourse and long description was too tiring for her, and soon she saw that the boys were losing interest. Nurse Edna had to give the nightly benediction instead of Dr. Larch. He refused to leave Nurse Angela's office. He said he was listening to an owl, and he wanted to keep listening. Nurse Edna felt extremely uncomfortable with the benediction, which she'd never fully understood. She took it for a kind of private joke between Dr. Larch and the universe. "Good night, Princes of Maine, Kings of New England." Nurse Edna peeped. "Where is Homer?" Several voices whispered. Nurse Edna, extremely agitated by Dr. Larch's behavior, went to Nurse Angela's office. She was going to walk in and tell Dr. Larch that he should give himself some ether and then get a good night's sleep. But Nurse Edna got shyer as she approached the light shining from the office. Dr. Larch was sitting at the typewriter, unmoving. He was composing in his mind the first of many letters he was going to write to Homer Wells. He was attempting to calm his thoughts. "Please be healthy, please be happy, please be careful," Wilbur Larch was thinking,